Blood always smells like copper, but betrayal smells like cheap ozone and stale coffee. That was the stench in our apartment when my father realized Toby was gone. My twin took the last of our cash, leaving nothing but an empty wardrobe and an unpaid debt to the most dangerous syndicate in the city. Tomorrow, Toby was supposed to marry a monster to save us. Today, I'm putting on his tailored wedding suit, preparing to bleed for a man who doesn't know I exist. Dust motes danced in the pale morning light, settling on the chipped linoleum of our kitchen floor. Albert, the man who contributed exactly half my DNA and a mountain of gambling debts, was hyperventilating by the sink. The sound was a wet, rattling gasp that grated against my eardrums. I didn't comfort him. I sat at the scratched Formica table, running a thumb over the cracked leather strap of an antique watch I'd been trying to repair. The metal casing was cold. It grounded me. Toby was gone. My beautiful, perfectly presented, sweet-smelling Omega brother had packed a single duffel bag and slipped out the fire escape at 3 a.m. He even took the emergency stash hidden behind the baseboard in the bathroom. "They're going to kill us, Robert," Albert choked out, gripping the edges of the sink until his knuckles turned the color of old bone. "Cassian Hale doesn't forgive. A broken contract." "I know what a broken contract means," I interrupted. My voice was flat, devoid of the panic he wanted me to mirror. I didn't feel brave. I felt entirely hollowed out, hollowed by years of anticipating this exact kind of disaster. Toby was the golden child. He was meant to be the savior, the pristine Omega traded to the Hale family to wipe our slate clean. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. I walked into the bedroom we shared. Toby's wedding suit hung in a pristine plastic garment bag against the closet door. It was a joke. I was a mechanic, a tinkerer, someone who spent 10 hours a day elbow-deep in grease and microscopic gears. My hands were calloused, the cuticles permanently stained with oil. Toby had soft hands, manicured nails, and a natural scent of spun sugar and ripe peaches. I smelled like bitter tea leaves and rain on asphalt. I unzipped the bag. The zipper hissed in the quiet room. "What are you doing?" Albert hovered in the doorway, reeking of sour sweat and cheap whiskey. "Putting on a suit," I said, pulling the heavy white silk shirt from the hanger. "You're not him. Hale will know. The moment you step into the same room, his wolf will know." "Then he shoots me," I said, unbuttoning my flannel. "Or he shoots you, or I put on enough synthetic blockers to choke a horse, stand at the altar, and buy us enough time for you to pack a bag and run." I wasn't doing it out of some profound, selfless love for my father. I was doing it because the exhaustion had finally eclipsed the fear. I was tired of waiting for the executioner. The silk of Toby's shirt felt like ice water against my skin. It fit, technically. We were identical twins, after all. But it felt completely wrong. It clung to my shoulders, restricting my movement. I reached for the vanity, knocking over a bottle of Toby's expensive cologne before grabbing the heavy-duty scent suppressants I used when I wanted to be ignored at the auto shop. I sprayed it at my pulse points. The chemical chill hit my skin, followed immediately by the acrid clinical smell of ozone and rubbing alcohol. It made the back of my throat burn. It suppressed the bitter tea scent of my natural pheromones, forcing my biology into a sterile, scentless void. Next came Toby's perfume, sickly sweet, peaches and vanilla. I sprayed it over the blockers until I felt nauseous. I looked in the mirror, same ash blonde hair, same sharp jawline, same gray eyes. But where Toby's eyes always held a spark of practiced innocence, mine looked dead. "Let's go," I said, walking past my father. "Don't talk to anyone, keep your head down, and the second the reception starts, you leave the city." The drive to the basilica was a blur of gray streets and the rhythmic thumping of the wipers against a persistent drizzle. The air inside the hired town car was stifling, thick with my artificial peach scent and Albert's radiating terror. I stared out the window, watching the neon signs bleed into the puddles on the sidewalk. When we arrived, a pair of men in sharply tailored black suits met us at the side entrance. They didn't smile. They didn't speak. They just opened the door and gestured into the dim, incense-heavy bowels of the church. The smell of burning myrrh hit me like a physical blow, mixing with the cloying sweetness I was radiating, churning the acid in my stomach. I didn't let my hands shake. I shoved them deep into the pockets of the white trousers, digging my fingernails into my palms until the sharp pain focused my mind. This was just a transaction, a signature, a vow, a cage. The organ music didn't swell, it crawled. The low, mournful notes vibrated through the stone floor and up through the soles of my polished dress shoes. The doors opened, and the main aisle of the cathedral stretched out before me, an endless gauntlet of dark, polished mahogany pews. The church was packed, but it was deathly silent. Hundreds of eyes locked onto me, the syndicates, the capos, the politicians in Hale's pocket. They weren't looking at me with admiration. They were appraising a newly acquired asset. I focused on the altar. Standing there, bathed in the muted light of stained glass, was Cassian Hale. He didn't look like a groom waiting for his beloved. He looked like a bored predator at a watering hole. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal three-piece suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. Dark hair swept back, sharp cheekbones, eyes as black as pitch. As I walked down the aisle, Albert's hand gripping my elbow with bruising force, I braced myself for the impact of Cassian's scent. Alphas of his caliber usually let their pheromones bleed out to establish dominance, but there was nothing, a void. It was more unnerving than a scream. He had total control over his biology. Albert released me at the altar, essentially shoving me the last half step, before retreating to the front pew. I stepped up beside Cassian. Close up, the illusion of his scentless void shattered. Beneath the fabric of his suit, I caught the faintest edge of it. Crushed pine needles, cold iron, and gun oil. It wasn't loud, but it was heavy. It pressed against the base of my skull, a primal frequency that made the dormant omega instincts in my blood twitch in warning. I swallowed hard, forcing my jaw to remain unclenched. The priest began to speak, droning on in Latin. I barely heard a word. I was hyper-aware of the space between Cassian's arm and mine. We weren't touching, but the ambient heat coming off his body was immense. He didn't look at me once during the sermon. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, utterly indifferent. "Your vows," the priest prompted softly, switching to English. Cassian turned his head. His eyes finally locked onto mine. There was no warmth, no anger, not even curiosity. Just a cold, calculating emptiness. "I, Cassian," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that scraped pleasantly against the quiet of the church. "Take you, Toby, to be my Omega, to claim, to hold, to protect." The words felt like a death sentence. The name Toby hung in the air, a bright neon lie. "Your turn," the priest whispered. My mouth was dry. I forced saliva down my throat. "I, Toby," I lied, the word tasting like ash. "Take you, Cassian, to be my alpha, to honor, to submit, to serve." Submission, a joke. My heart pounded a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. Cassian reached out and took my left hand. His skin was rough. Thick calluses lined his palm and the pads of his fingers. The hands of a man who handled weapons, who broke things. The contrast to my own rough hands should have given me away immediately. Toby's hands were supposed to be soft. I saw Cassian's thumb brush over a faint white scar on my knuckle, a remnant of a slipped wrench. His brow twitched, a microscopic movement. He slid the heavy gold band onto my ring finger. It was cold. It felt like a shackle snapping shut. The rest of the ceremony was a blur of flashbulbs and forced handshakes. The reception was held in the church's grand hall. I stood by Cassian's side like a well-dressed mannequin. I didn't drink the champagne. I didn't eat the caviar. I just nodded when people spoke to me, playing the part of the demure, overwhelmed bride. Albert had vanished. Good. An hour into the reception, Cassian leaned down, his mouth mere inches from my ear. The smell of pine and iron spiked. "We are leaving." He didn't wait for my response. He turned and walked toward the exit, I followed, keeping my eyes fixed on the broad line of his shoulders. The ride to the Hale estate was suffocating. The partition between us and the driver was raised. The plush leather seats of the Maybach felt like quicksand. Outside the tinted windows, the city lights blurred into streaks of yellow and red. Cassian poured himself a glass of amber liquid from the crystal decanter in the console. He didn't offer me one. "You're quiet," he observed, swirling the liquor. He didn't look at me. "It's been a long day," I replied, keeping my voice soft, trying to mimic the gentle cadence Toby naturally possessed. Cassian took a slow sip. "You reek of synthetic peach." My blood ran cold. The temperature in the car seemed to drop 10 degrees. I kept my face blank, staring at my hands folded neatly in my lap. "It's my favorite perfume." "It's giving me a migraine," he stated flatly. "Go wash it off the moment we arrive." "Yes." The silence returned, heavier this time. I pressed my back against the door, putting as much distance between us as the car allowed. The engine hummed beneath us, carrying me further away from my life and deeper into a lie that was rapidly unspooling. The Hale estate wasn't a house. It was a fortress masquerading as a modern architectural marvel. Concrete, glass, and steel jutted out of the side of a cliff, overlooking the churning black waters of the bay. The rain had picked up, lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows as Cassian led me through the cavernous foyer. There were no servants in sight. No guards inside, though I had seen dozens patrolling the perimeter. The silence in the house was absolute, broken only by the sharp click of Cassian's leather shoes on the slate floor. "Upstairs. Last door on the right," Cassian said, pausing at the base of a floating glass staircase. He finally turned to look at me, his dark eyes sweeping over my tailored white suit. "Wash that chemical spill off your neck. I'll be up in an hour." "Otsuyu?" He turned on his heel and disappeared down a dark hallway, likely toward a study or a cellar to brood. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My knees felt weak. I gripped the glass railing and hauled myself up the stairs. The master bedroom was massive, sterile, and unforgivingly cold. A king-sized bed dominated the center of the room, draped in dark gray silk sheets. There were no personal touches, no photos, no books. It looked like a high-end hotel room waiting for a ghost. I moved straight to the ensuite bathroom. It was all black marble and harsh, recessed lighting. I stripped off the white jacket, letting it hit the floor. I tore at the silk tie, then the buttons of the shirt. When I was finally down to my undershirt, I turned on the sink, letting the water run scalding hot. I grabbed a rough washcloth, lathered it with an unscented bar of soap I found in the shower, and started scrubbing my neck. I scrubbed until the skin was raw and bright red. I scrubbed away the sickly sweet peach perfume. I scrubbed away the harsh chemical scent blockers. I washed my face, watching the pale, exhausted stranger in the mirror. Without the blockers, my natural scent began to seep back into the air. Bitter black tea, damp earth, the sharp tang of rain on pavement. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't inviting, it was defensive and closed off. I stepped out of the bathroom, leaving the white suit piled on the marble floor. I found a heavy dark gray bathrobe hanging in the closet and wrapped it tightly around myself, tying the belt in a double knot. I sat on the edge of the massive bed. The mattress barely gave way under my weight. I waited. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the hour. The bedroom door opened with a soft click. Cassian stepped inside. He had discarded his jacket and tie, the top 3 buttons of his charcoal shirt undone. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, his eyes closed. Then, his head snapped up. His nostrils flared. I saw the exact moment the realization hit him. The predatory stillness that had defined him all day suddenly shattered. His posture stiffened. The suppressed aura of his alpha biology broke free, flooding the room like a physical shockwave. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of crushed pine and ozone, aggressive and demanding. My own biology reacted instantly. My heart slammed against my ribs, and a primal, humiliating urge to bare my neck flared in my hindbrain. I fought it down, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. I refused to cower. Cassian walked slowly toward the bed. He didn't look angry. He looked fascinated, like a scientist observing a particularly strange, venomous insect. He stopped 2 feet away from me. "You aren't him," Cassian said. The gravel in his voice was gone, replaced by a deadly quiet smoothness. I looked up at him, my gray eyes meeting his pitch-black ones. "No, I'm not." "Where is Tobias?" "Gone," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline shaking my limbs. "He took a bag and disappeared last night. He wasn't built for this. He would have broken in a week." Cassian tilted his head. He leaned down, placing a hand on the mattress on either side of my hips, caging me in. The heat radiating from him was blistering. "And you?" he murmured, leaning closer until his nose brushed the curve of my jaw, inhaling deeply. I shivered, hating myself for the involuntary physical response. "What are you built for? You smell like bitter tea and engine grease. Your hands are covered in calluses. You don't smell like an Omega meant to be pampered." "I'm his twin," I said, forcing myself not to lean away from his touch. "Robert, I'm the spare." Cassian pulled back slightly, his eyes searching my face. He traced the line of my jaw with a thumb, his rough skin scraping against mine. "Your father thought he could scam me with a defective substitute?" Cassian's lips curved into a cold, humorless smile. "He owes me $3 million. Tobias was the collateral. Now I have a mechanic sitting on my bed." "Shoot me then," I said, the cynicism finally bleeding into my voice. "Or throw me out. I don't care. The contract is broken. I just needed to buy Albert enough time to get out of the state." Cassian stared at me for a long, silent minute. The oppressive weight of his alpha scent slowly began to recede, pulling back into that terrifying, controlled void. He straightened up, looking down at me as I sat there in his oversized robe. "Shoot you?" Cassian repeated softly, turning toward the small wet bar in the corner of the room. He picked up a glass. "No, Robert, that would be a waste. Your brother would have been a beautiful, boring ornament, but you—" He poured 2 fingers of whiskey and turned back to face me, his eyes gleaming with dark intent in the dim light. "You have spine, and I think breaking you is going to be far more entertaining." Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with the harsh, mechanical whir of the espresso machine down the hall. I opened my eyes to a ceiling of exposed concrete. My neck ached. I had spent the night curled on the extreme edge of the mattress, my muscles locked in a rigid defense against a man who never even came to bed. The space beside me was perfectly flat, the gray silk unwrinkled. Cassian had taken his whiskey and vanished, leaving me alone in the sterile expanse of his bedroom. I sat up, the heavy bathrobe slipping off my shoulder. The air in the room was cold, regulated by an invisible climate control system that hummed a constant low G note. I rubbed the grit from my eyes and padded barefoot into the massive walk-in closet. My cheap flannel and jeans from yesterday were gone. In their place hung rows of neutral, high-end garments, cashmere sweaters, dark denim, crisp button-downs. None of it was my style. None of it was Toby's either. It was a wardrobe curated for a ghost. I grabbed the darkest sweater I could find and a pair of stiff black jeans. They fit perfectly. Of course they did. Men like Cassian Hale didn't leave details like measurements to chance. Finding the kitchen was a matter of following the smell of roasted coffee beans. The ground floor of the estate was a labyrinth of glass walls and minimalist furniture, offering uninterrupted views of the churning ocean below the cliffs. A man stood at the kitchen island, wiping down the black granite counter. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a simple gray t-shirt that failed to hide the holster strapped to his ribs. He didn't look up when my bare feet slapped against the hardwood. "Coffee's in the pot. Mugs are in the cabinet on your left," he grunted. His voice was thick, like he had swallowed gravel. "Thanks." I poured a cup. The ceramic was heavy, completely black. No logos, no chipped edges. I took a sip. It was scalding, bitter, and perfect. "I'm Robert," The man finally paused, his pale blue eyes locking onto mine. He took a slow breath through his nose, analyzing the air. My scent blockers were completely washed away. I knew what I smelled like: black tea and wet pavement, not the spun sugar he was expecting. "Dominic," he replied, his face giving nothing away. "Cassian left an hour ago. He said you have run of the house, but if you step past the electronic gates at the end of the driveway, the dogs will tear you apart before my men even have to draw their weapons." Noted. Not. I leaned against the counter, wrapping both hands around the hot mug to chase away the chill. "Does he usually leave his hostages alone on the first day?" "You aren't a hostage," Dominic said, tossing the rag into the sink. "You're collateral. There's a difference." "Enlighten me." "A hostage has an expiration date. Collateral just sits on the shelf until the debt is paid." Dominic stared at me for a long moment, his gaze lingering on the grease stains permanently embedded in my cuticles. "Though I gotta admit, you don't look like much of a prize." "Glad we agree." I took another sip of coffee. "Do you have a toolbox?" Dominic blinked. The request clearly derailed whatever intimidation tactic he was attempting. "A what?" "A toolbox. Screwdrivers. Wrench. Pliers. My hands are twitching, Dominic, and if I don't take something apart, I'm going to start peeling the veneer off these expensive cabinets just to see how they're glued." He stared at me as if I had spoken in tongues, then shook his head, a dry chuckle escaping his chest. "Garage. Down the hall, take the elevator to sublevel 2. Don't touch the cars." I spent the next 6 hours in the subterranean garage. It was a sterile, brightly lit cavern housing millions of dollars worth of automotive engineering. Aston Martins, classic muscle cars, a sleek black Maybach. I ignored them all, focusing instead on a malfunctioning industrial floor scrubber I found shoved in a utility closet. I stripped the casing down, laying the screws out in a neat line on a shop towel. My hands moved on autopilot, tracing wires, checking fuses, assessing the carbon brushes in the motor. The smell of old grease and ozone filled the air, perfectly masking the bitter tea scent of my anxiety. This was my sanctuary. Metal didn't lie. Machines broke for a logical reason, and they could be fixed if you understood the sequence. "You're getting oil on the floor." The voice cut through the quiet hum of the garage. I didn't flinch, but my hand tightened around the handle of my screwdriver. I turned my head. Cassian stood near the elevator banks. He had stripped off his suit jacket, his white shirt rolled up to the elbows. He looked tired, the shadows under his dark eyes more pronounced than yesterday. The oppressive scent of pine and iron was tightly coiled, restricted, but I could still feel the heavy thrum of his presence pressing against my skin. "It wipes up," I said, turning back to the motor. "The armature is shot. Someone ran this thing without water in the tank and burned it out." I heard the slow, deliberate scuff of his leather shoes approaching. He stopped just behind me. I could feel the heat radiating off his body, a phantom weight settling over my shoulders. My Omega biology, stupid and traitorous, urged me to tilt my neck, to acknowledge the proximity of an apex predator. I clenched my jaw and focused on re-threading a bolt. "I didn't marry a mechanic," Cassian observed, his tone dangerously flat. "You didn't marry me at all," I shot back, finally dropping the screwdriver and standing up. I wiped my hands on a grease rag, meeting his gaze squarely. "You married a piece of paper with my brother's name on it. Worse C." Cassian's eyes dropped to my hands, tracing the dark streaks of grease across my knuckles, down to the heavy gold band on my left ring finger. It looked absurd there, a pristine shackle surrounded by dirt. "Get cleaned up," Cassian ordered, his gaze snapping back to my face. "We have a dinner tonight." I thought I was collateral, supposed to sit on a shelf. "You are whatever I need you to be, Robert." He stepped closer, invading my personal space. The scent of crushed pine needles spiked, sharp and demanding. "Tonight, I need the syndicates to see that my new Omega is obedient, presentable, and entirely mine. They expect Tobias. They will get you. If you embarrass me, I won't kill you. I'll just find Albert. The mention of my father sent a cold spike of adrenaline through my veins. It wasn't love that made me panic. It was the sheer exhaustion of having my life tethered to his failures. I don't have Toby's clothes, I said, my voice dropping an octave as I fought to keep the defiance out of it. I don't have his scent. Anyone with half a brain is going to know I'm not the Omega from the photographs. Cassian reached out. I braced myself for a strike, but his fingers merely brushed the collar of my borrowed sweater, adjusting it with terrifying gentleness. Let me worry about what people think, he murmured, his thumb grazing the pulse point on my neck. My breath hitched. He smiled, a small, cruel curve of his mouth. Be ready at 7. The restaurant was a subterranean speakeasy in the financial district, accessible only through the kitchen of a failing Italian joint. The air inside was thick with cigar smoke, roasted garlic, and the heavy, aggressive pheromones of dozens of uncollared alphas. I wore a dark charcoal suit that Dominic had dumped on my bed an hour before we left. It lacked the white silk and delicate lace that Toby would have worn. It was severe, structured, and made me look less like a blushing bride and more like a junior partner in a hostile takeover. I had scrubbed my hands raw with pumice stone, but the faint gray shadows of grease remained in the creases of my skin. Cassian walked beside me, his hand resting a fraction of an inch above the small of my back. He wasn't touching me, but the territorial proximity was a glaring neon sign to every alpha in the room. We approached a large circular booth at the back of the dimly lit room. 4 men sat there, their faces illuminated by the flickering amber light of the table lamps. The conversation died the moment Cassian approached. Hail? A heavily scarred man with a thick Russian accent grunted, shifting his bulk in the leather booth. His eyes darted to me, raking over my dark suit, my unstyled hair, my calloused hands. You brought the prize. Sit, Cassian instructed me softly. I slid into the booth. Cassian slid in right beside me, his thigh pressing flush against mine. The physical contact was electric, a sudden jolt of heat that made my spine go rigid. I tried to shift away, but Cassian's arm draped casually over the back of the booth, his fingers digging lightly into the fabric of my jacket, pinning me in place. He doesn't smell like a prize, another man sneered, leaning across the table. He was young, maybe 30, with slicked back hair and a scent that smelled nauseatingly of burnt plastic and cheap cologne. I heard Albert's kid was a real beauty, smelled like peaches. This one smells like... The man took an exaggerated sniff, like a fucking chop shop. My hands curled into fists under the table. I stared at the scarred mahogany wood biting the inside of my cheek. Cassian didn't raise his voice. He didn't even drop his casual posture. He reached forward with his free hand, picked up a heavy crystal ashtray, and casually slammed it into the center of the table. The sharp crack echoed over the low jazz playing in the background. His scent, Cassian said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, lethal whisper, is mine to critique. His presence is mine to command. If you have an issue with the way my Omega smells, Julian, I can remove your nose. The silence at the table became absolute. The burnt plastic scent coming from the younger man soured into sheer terror. Just an observation, Cassian, the Russian muttered, raising his hands in a placating gesture. No disrespect intended to your union. Cassian leaned back, his fingers resuming their light, rhythmic tapping against my shoulder. Good. Let's talk about the docks. For the next 2 hours, I sat frozen as millions of dollars in illegal cargo were negotiated over plates of untouched veal and expensive wine. I didn't speak. I barely breathed. The heat radiating from Cassian's thigh burned through my trousers, an unrelenting reminder of my exact place in the hierarchy. He had defended me, but it wasn't protection. It was a display of property rights. I was his dog, and only he was allowed to kick me. Yet, as the night dragged on, a strange, sickening contradiction began to bloom in my chest. The heavy, oppressive scent of Cassian's pine and iron, which had terrified me yesterday, was now acting as a shield. The other alphas in the room were directing their aggressive pheromones toward the table, trying to establish dominance in the negotiation. But whenever the chemical pressure threatened to overwhelm me, Cassian's scent would spike, wrapping around me like a dense, impenetrable fog. My Omega biology recognized it. Safe, my hindbrain whispered, a treacherous, submissive instinct that made me want to lean into his chest and let him handle the threat. I hated it. I hated him for invoking it, and I hated myself for feeling it. I focused on the mechanics of the room instead. I counted the exits. I noted the bulge of holstered weapons under the jackets of the guards standing by the doors. I analyzed the hinge structure of the heavy brass door leading to the bathrooms. Anything to keep my mind sharp, to keep the bitter tea of my own scent walled off behind a cold, hard logic. When the meeting finally concluded, Cassian stood up. He didn't offer me his hand. He just turned and walked toward the exit, expecting me to follow. I did. The ride back to the estate was suffocatingly quiet. The rain had returned, drumming a frantic rhythm against the roof of the car. Cassian sat in the corner, staring out the window, nursing a glass of bourbon. "You didn't shake," he said suddenly, not looking at me. "Excuse me?" "Julian deliberately flooded the table with aggressive pheromones to test my control," Cassian explained, taking a slow sip. Most Omegas would have been trembling, weeping, or baring their necks by the salad course. You just sat there. You were counting the screws in the light fixtures. "I was calculating the load-bearing capacity of the support beams, actually," I replied dryly. "If the ceiling collapsed, I wanted to know which way to dive." Cassian turned his head, his dark eyes catching the passing streetlights. A genuine, albeit microscopic smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You are a strange creature, Robert." "I'm a survivor," I corrected him, looking away. "Don't confuse my coping mechanisms for bravery. I just know that panicking doesn't fix a broken engine." "No," Cassian murmured, the scent of pine softening slightly in the enclosed space. "It just gets you killed." The illusion of stability shattered 3 nights later. It was 2 a.m. I was sitting on the floor of the subterranean garage, completely dismantling the carburetor of a 1969 Mustang. Dominic had eventually given up trying to keep me out of the cars, deciding that letting me scrub engine parts in chemical solvent was better than having me pace the halls like a caged animal. The heavy steel door connecting the garage to the sub-basement stairwell slammed open. I jumped, dropping my wrench. It clattered loudly against the concrete. Cassian stumbled through the doorway. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His white shirt was untucked, soaked entirely on the left side with a wet, blossoming crimson stain. The heavy, coppery stench of fresh blood hit the air, violently clashing with the sharp tang of engine grease and gasoline. He leaned heavily against the concrete wall, his breathing shallow and erratic. His dark eyes were blown wide, tracking the room blindly before locking onto me sitting on the floor. "Dominic?" Cassian gasped, his knees buckling slightly. "Call Dominic." I didn't think. I scrambled to my feet, kicking the carburetor parts aside, and crossed the garage in a dead sprint. "Dominic is off rotation tonight," I said, grabbing his right arm and hauling it over my shoulder before he could hit the floor. He was incredibly heavy, dense with muscle and dead weight. "It's just Marco upstairs, and he's out patrolling the perimeter." "Don't call Marco," Cassian grunted, his fingers digging into my shoulder with bruising force. "Nobody else." I understood immediately. Weakness was a death sentence in his world. If the lower ranks smelled blood, they would circle. "All right, hold on to me." I adjusted my grip, wrapping my arm tight around his waist, careful to avoid the soaked left side. "We're going to the elevator." Every step was a battle. Cassian's breathing was a wet, ragged sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The scent of pine and iron was completely unhinged now, rolling off him in chaotic, aggressive waves, mixed with the terrifying smell of pain. My own scent flared in response, not bitter and closed off, but a sudden, sharp burst of black tea and soothing rain. It was an involuntary biological command to comfort a wounded alpha. I gritted my teeth against the instinct, focusing on the sheer physical mechanics of moving his body. I got him into the elevator and slammed the button for the master floor. "What happened?" I demanded, watching a drop of blood fall from his shirt tail onto the polished steel floor. "Disagreement," he choked out, leaning his head back against the mirror. His skin was shockingly pale, covered in a sheen of cold sweat. "Ambush at the warehouse." "Where is it?" "Lower left rib, grazed. Bullet didn't stay in." The elevator dinged. I practically dragged him down the hall, kicking the bedroom door open and maneuvering him into the enormous ensuite bathroom. I dropped him onto the closed toilet seat. He slumped forward, a low groan vibrating in his chest. "Stay awake," I ordered, my voice harsh to mask the tremor in my hands. I tore through the pristine cabinets until I found the heavy black trauma kit Dominic had shown me on my first day. I threw the kit onto the marble counter and unzipped it. Gauze, saline, surgical scissors, bandages, antiseptic. "I need your shirt off," I said, stepping between his spread knees. Cassian's hands fumbled uselessly with the buttons. He was losing too much blood, his fine motor skills rapidly deteriorating. "Stop. Let me." I batted his hands away. My fingers, still stained with car grease, were remarkably steady as I undid the buttons and peeled the soaked silk away from his skin. His torso was heavily muscled and marred by old, faded silver scars. But my focus was entirely on the bleeding gash along his left rib cage. It was an ugly, jagged tear where the bullet had ripped through the flesh. He was right. It was a through and through, but it was deep. "This is going to burn," I warned, grabbing a bottle of sterile saline. Cassian didn't respond. He just stared at my face, his dark eyes tracking my movements. I squeezed the saline over the wound. Cassian's entire body went rigid. A sharp hiss escaped his teeth, and his hands shot out, gripping my hips to anchor himself against the pain. His fingers dug painfully into the denim of my jeans. "Breathe," I muttered, grabbing a sterile gauze pad and pressing it hard against the wound to staunch the flow. "You don't panic," Cassian whispered, his forehead dropping forward to rest against my collarbone. The contact sent a jolt of electricity straight down my spine. His breath was hot against my neck, brushing the exact spot where a mating bite would go. My pulse skyrocketed. The overwhelming scent of his blood and his distressed alpha pheromones was intoxicating, drowning out the rational, cynical mechanic in my brain. "It's just plumbing, Cassian," I lied, my voice cracking slightly. I kept the pressure on his side, ignoring the heat of his skin against my chest. "Holes and leaks. You patch the leak, you keep the engine running." "Am I an engine to you, Robert?" He slurred slightly, the pain pulling down his defenses. "Right now you're a mess," I deflected. I carefully pulled the bloody gauze away. The bleeding had slowed to an ooze. I grabbed the butterfly closures from the kit. "Hold still. I'm going to pull the edges together." I worked quickly and efficiently, treating his body with the same detached precision I used on a cracked manifold. I taped the wound shut, cleaned the surrounding skin with antiseptic, and wrapped a thick layer of medical tape tightly around his ribs. When I finished, my hands were covered in his blood. I stepped back, breaking the contact between us. The sudden cold air hitting my chest where his head had rested felt like a physical loss. I hated it. Cassian remained sitting on the toilet lid, his chest heaving slightly as he looked down at the neat, professional bandage wrapping his torso. He looked up at me. The vulnerability in his eyes was gone, replaced by a calculating, intense stare that made my skin prickle. "You could have let me bleed out," Cassian said quietly. "You could have called Albert. You could have walked out the front door." "I told you," I said, turning to the sink and turning the water on full blast. I scrubbed the blood off my hands, watching the pink foam spiral down the drain. "The dogs would have eaten me. The dogs are locked in the kennels on Tuesdays." I froze. My hands stopped moving under the scalding water. I looked at his reflection in the mirror. Cassian was watching me, his expression unreadable. He had given me a way out, and I had stayed to fix him. I grabbed a towel and dried my hands, avoiding his gaze. Go to sleep, Cassian. You look like hell. I walked out of the bathroom, leaving him sitting in the harsh light. I didn't go back to the garage. I sat on the extreme edge of the massive gray bed, staring at the wall, listening to the rain, and realizing with a sickening sense of dread that the cage door had been open all night, and I had chosen not to run. 2 days passed in a tense, heavily medicated blur. Cassian didn't leave the estate. He barely left the ground floor, choosing to hold his meetings from the massive slate dining table while hooked up to a saline drip Dominic had expertly concealed beneath a tailored blazer. I didn't go back to the garage. I told myself it was because Dominic had threatened to change the security codes if I didn't keep an eye on his stubborn boss, but that was a lie. I stayed because the engine was misfiring, and I couldn't walk away from a broken machine. The estate felt different with Cassian bleeding. The sterile, impenetrable fortress had a crack in its foundation. The heavy scent of pine and iron was muted, laced heavily with the sharp, acidic tang of antibiotics and physical trauma. I was standing at the kitchen island, methodically slicing a green apple. The knife was ceramic, heavy in my hand. Outside, the sky was a bruised purple, threatening another torrential downpour. "You're cutting those too thin." Cassian's voice rasped from the dining area. I didn't look up. I just dragged the blade through the crisp flesh of the apple, the wet snick echoing off the glass walls. "I'm eating them, not you," I replied, tossing a paper-thin slice into my mouth. The tartness snapped across my tongue. "You should be asleep." "I have a conference call with the longshoreman in 10 minutes. I heard the slow, agonizing shuffle of his chair pushing back. His footsteps were heavy, uneven. He stopped at the opposite side of the kitchen island. He looked terrible. The charcoal sweater he wore was loose, but I could see the rigid posture he maintained to keep pressure off his left side. His jaw was covered in dark stubble, and the bags under his eyes looked like bruises. Yet the sheer, oppressive gravity of his presence remained intact. "Your bandage needs changing," I observed, pointing the tip of the ceramic knife at his ribs. "After the call." "Now," I countered, putting the knife down. "Unless you want to bleed through cashmere while negotiating shipping lanes." Cassian stared at me. A long, suffocating moment passed where his alpha biology flared, a sudden sharp spike of indignation at being given an order. My pulse kicked in my throat, a biological warning to back down, to bare my neck and apologize. I gripped the edge of the granite counter until my knuckles ached, forcing my spine to stay straight. I met his pitch-black eyes and refused to blink. The heavy scent of pine slowly receded. Cassian gave a short, breathy exhale that might have been a laugh if it wasn't laced with pain. "Fine. Change it." He gripped the hem of his sweater and pulled it over his head with a wince, tossing it onto the stool next to him. I grabbed the medical kit from the pantry and walked around the island. Up close, the heat radiating off his skin was a physical pressure. The bruising around the bullet wound had bloomed into an ugly collage of yellow, purple, and deep black. I peeled the medical tape away. Cassian's stomach muscles jumped involuntarily, but he didn't make a sound. I cleaned the dried blood with methodical, detached precision. "Your hands are shaking, Robert," he murmured. His voice was entirely too close to my ear. "I had too much coffee," I lied, taping a fresh gauze pad over the stitches. The truth was, his proximity was short-circuiting my nervous system. I was a mechanic. I understood leverage, torque, and friction. I didn't understand the violent, territorial possessiveness that flared in my chest every time I looked at the wound someone else had put on him. Before I could step back, the heavy, reinforced iron gates at the end of the driveway shrieked open. Cassian's head snapped toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The perimeter alarms didn't blare, which meant whoever was coming through had clearance. A black SUV tore up the wet asphalt, slamming to a halt in front of the main doors. Dominic stepped out of the driver's side. He walked around to the back, yanked the door open, and dragged someone out by the collar of their jacket. My breath caught in my throat. Even from a distance, through the rain-streaked glass, I recognized the mop of ash-blonde hair. I recognized the expensive ruined silk shirt, It was Toby. Dominic dragged my twin brother up the front steps and shoved the heavy oak door open. The commotion spilled into the pristine foyer. "Found him in a motel in Southside," Dominic grunted, shoving Toby forward. Toby stumbled, his knees hitting the slate floor with a sickening crack. Albert tipped us off. Seems the old man decided trading his favorite son's location was worth clearing his own kneecaps. Toby was sobbing. The sound was high, thin, and hysterical. He looked up, his face smeared with dirt and tears. He saw me standing next to Cassian, my hand still hovering near Cassian's bare, bandaged chest. Toby's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. And then, the smell hit us. It wasn't the synthetic, sickly sweet perfume I had choked myself with on the wedding day. It was Toby's real scent. Overripe peaches, spun sugar, and blinding, terrified distress. It flooded the kitchen, thick and cloying, sticking to the back of my throat like syrup. It was the scent of a perfect submissive Omega in total panic. Cassian didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his bare chest rising and falling slowly. He didn't look at Toby with desire or relief. He looked at him the way one looks at a roach on a dining table. "Robert!" Toby shrieked, scrambling backward across the floor away from Dominic. "Robert, please, help me! Dad sold me out. He took the rest of the money and ran—" "Shut up!" Dominic snapped, raising a hand. Toby flinched violently, curling into a tight, trembling ball. I stood frozen. I was looking at a mirror image of myself. Same face, same hair, same build. But we couldn't have been more different. Toby was soft, pampered, built for a life of submission and luxury. I was rust and bone, built to endure. For years I had resented him. I had hated his easy smile, his perfect scent, the way our father looked at him like he was a winning lottery ticket while I was just the spare tire. Now, watching him weep on the floor of a Mafia capo's foyer, I just felt a hollow, aching pity. I took a step toward him, a hand clamped down on my wrist. Cassian's grip was like a steel vise. He didn't pull me back, but he stopped my forward momentum completely. "Where are you going?" Cassian asked. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "He's my brother," I said, my voice sounding incredibly loud in the sudden silence of the room. "He is a breach of contract," Cassian corrected, his dark eyes finally leaving Toby to bore into the side of my face. "He abandoned you to a man he believed was a monster. He left you to take his bullet." The words felt like a physical blow. The absolute truth of them stripped away the last layer of brotherly obligation I had been clinging to. Toby hadn't just run, he had thrown me to the wolves, hoping they would be too busy eating me to chase him. I looked down at Toby. His terrified gray eyes met mine. "Robert, please," Toby whimpered, his sweet peach scent souring into something rotten. Tell him I'm his. I'm the one he married. I'm Toby. I can be good." Toby's desperate plea hung in the air, pathetic and damning. He was offering himself up, trying to cash in the very ticket he had abandoned, assuming the alpha would naturally prefer the genuine article over the defective spare. I felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea. "Let him go," I said to Cassian, my voice dropping into a harsh, mechanical deadpan. "You have him now. The real thing. Soft hands, sweet scent, obedient. He's exactly what you paid for. Let me go." Cassian's grip on my wrist tightened until the bones ground together. I didn't flinch. I refused to let him see the sudden, terrifying spike of panic in my chest. If he let me go, I was homeless, penniless, and alone. But worse, far, far worse, was the realization that a dark, twisted part of my brain didn't want to leave this cage. Cassian finally released my wrist. He turned his attention fully to Toby. He took a slow, agonizing step forward, his bare feet silent on the slate floor. Dominic stepped back, giving his boss a wide berth. The heavy, suffocating aura of Cassian's alpha scent uncoiled, flooding the room. The scent of crushed pine and freezing ozone completely annihilated Toby's sugary peach pheromones. Toby pressed himself flat against the floor, a soft, involuntary whine of total submission escaping his throat. It was biology overriding logic. Cassian stopped a few feet away from my brother. He looked down, his expression completely blank. "Tobias," Cassian said. The name sounded foreign in his mouth. Harsh. "Yes," Toby sobbed, keeping his neck bared. "I'm sorry, I was scared. I'm yours." "You are a coward," Cassian stated, the clinical detachment in his voice more terrifying than any shouting. "You smell like rotting fruit. You whine like a beaten dog. And you think you have the fortitude to stand beside me?" Toby choked on a sob, confusion warring with terror on his face. "I don't need a pet, Tobias," Cassian continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I don't need someone who shatters the moment the wind changes direction. When I was bleeding out on a concrete floor, your brother didn't weep. He didn't bare his neck. He sewed me back together with hands covered in engine grease and my blood." Cassian turned his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto me. The intensity in his stare was a physical weight. "I ordered a husband," Cassian said softly, though the words carried perfectly across the room. "But what I got was a partner. You are obsolete, Tobias." Toby let out a strangled gasp, burying his face in his hands. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought my chest would crack open. My own scent, bitter black tea and damp earth, spiked involuntarily, a sharp defensive barrier wrapping around myself. But it didn't clash with Cassian's pine and ozone. It wove into it. The two scents tangled in the air, finding a strange, jagged harmony. "Dominic," Cassian said, not breaking eye contact with me. "Sir, do you eat? Take Tobias to the airstrip. Put him on a plane to Europe. Give him enough cash to disappear. If he ever steps foot in my city again, don't bother calling me. Just bury him." "No!" Toby screamed, thrashing as Dominic hauled him up by the back of his jacket. "Robert, you can't let him do this. Robert, please." I stood still. I felt cold, utterly devoid of emotion as I watched my twin brother being dragged toward the door. "You left me, Toby," I said. My voice was quiet, but it sliced through his screaming like a scalpel. "You put your suit on me and left me to die. Have a good flight." Dominic dragged him out. The heavy oak door slammed shut, cutting off Toby's hysterical sobbing. The sudden silence in the foyer was deafening. I stared at the empty space where my brother had just been. A strange numbness washed over me, a feeling of finality. The last tie to my old life had just been severed, cleanly and brutally. Albert was gone. Toby was exiled. I was entirely alone. No, not alone. I turned back to the kitchen. Cassian was leaning heavily against the granite island, his skin ashen. The adrenaline of the confrontation had burned out, leaving the pain of his gunshot wound in its wake. I walked slowly back to the island. I picked up the heavy gold band sitting next to the sink, the ring I had taken off to wash my hands before dealing with his bandages. I looked at it. It wasn't just a prop anymore. It was a brand. Cassian watched me, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. "You're shaking again, Robert," he noted softly. "I'm adjusting the torque," I muttered, sliding the cold gold band back onto my left ring finger. It clicked against the ceramic knife on the counter. "You're an idiot, Cassian." "Careful," he warned, a faint dark amusement flickering in his eyes. "You just threw away a compliant, terrified Omega who would have never questioned you for a mechanic who's probably going to poison your coffee one day." "I don't drink your coffee," Cassian replied, pushing himself off the counter. He took a slow, painful step toward me. He didn't stop until he was mere inches away. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the iron of his blood mixing with the aggressive pine of his pheromones. "And I don't want compliance." Cassian raised a hand. His knuckles were bruised, the skin rough and calloused. He traced the line of my jaw, his thumb brushing against my lower lip. The touch was light, but it sent a violent shockwave through my nervous system. I want someone who can look at a broken machine and know exactly how to fix it, Cassian murmured, his dark eyes dropping to my mouth. I want rust and bone. I want the spare. He didn't wait for permission. He leaned down, his mouth crashing into mine. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It tasted like bitter tea, copper, and sheer territorial violence. It was a claim, raw and imperfect. My hands moved entirely on instinct, grabbing the lapels of his discarded sweater on the stool behind him, anchoring myself as my biology screamed in a chaotic mix of submission and defiance. I kissed him back with equal ferocity, my teeth grazing his bottom lip until I tasted the faint, metallic tang of blood. He let out a low, predatory growl that vibrated against my chest, his hands dropping to my waist, gripping me hard enough to bruise. We broke apart, both breathing heavily. The air in the kitchen was saturated with our mixed scents, a heavy, intoxicating fog of pine, rain, iron, and black tea. The contract, I gasped, resting my forehead against his collarbone, careful not to press against his wound. The contract was for Tobias. The contract is ashes, Cassian replied, his arms wrapping around me, locking me in a cage of heat and muscle. You are my husband, Robert, not by a piece of paper, by right. I closed my eyes, listening to the steady, powerful thumping of his heart against my ear. I'd spent my entire life trying to fix things, repairing broken engines, patching up Albert's mistakes, covering for Toby's flaws. I had always been the background noise, the greasy hands working in the dark while the rest of the world shined. But standing here, anchored to a bleeding mafia boss who looked at my grease-stained hands like they held the keys to his kingdom, I realized I didn't want to fix this. Cassian Hale was a monster. He was dangerous, ruthless, and his world was built on blood and rust. But he saw me. He didn't want the perfect illusion. He wanted the gritty, flawed reality. I pulled back slightly, looking up into his pitch-black eyes. The cynical mechanic in my brain was screaming at me to run, to find a way out before the heavy steel doors of this life locked completely. But the quiet, exhausted part of my soul, the part that just wanted a place to land, stayed entirely still. If you ever lock me out of the garage again, I said, my voice steady, I'll dismantle the Maybach and sell it for parts. Cassian's mouth curved into a slow, devastatingly genuine smile. It changed his entire face, stripping away the cold predator and revealing the terrifyingly human man underneath. Understood, he whispered. He leaned down and kissed me again, slower this time. The friction between our lives was still there, grinding like unoiled gears, but the sequence made sense. The engine had finally caught. We were broken, volatile, and entirely toxic. And for the first time in my life, I felt perfectly at home. That's a wrap on Robert and Cassian's explosive journey. If this dark, gritty take on the Omegaverse kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. We thrive on bringing you raw, unfiltered stories that break the mold. Drop a comment below. Did Cassian make the right choice throwing Toby out, or is there still hell to pay? Share this video with your friends who love a toxic but grounded mafia romance, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our next chaotic upload. Stay dark, stay reading.